up with where we left off back in America after World War One. Troops are returning home. Uh, America's bloodied by war, a little bit disillusioned by the peace, and Americans return to its own heritage and turn inward. We're going to turn inward. Remember that progressive movement where we wanted to be global and have colonies? After World War One, we've had enough of the rest of the world. Back to in ourselves. Isolationism to the extreme once again.
I feel like we say that a lot and then literally just hop into fights.
Yeah, maybe. Well, people need us. We're a good teammate. Yeah. Now, we turned so far inward that we would even, like, our government would even shun diplomatic commitments to foreign countries. Like, we're not even talking to anybody else. Just leave us alone. We're going to stay on our little island over here in the Western Hemisphere. You can have the rest of the world. Leave us this half. That's all we need. So, once again, you're going to see some anti-foreignism once again, as you might imagine. Do you think a lot of people that had their homes destroyed in Europe in World War I might like to come to America for a better life? Yeah. Do you think they do? Yeah, and they're welcomed with open arms, right?
Did we welcome Germans then?
Some, but were they really welcomed? No. You begin to see another rise and increase in anti-foreignism, nativism. This is a definite theme in American history. The Irish in the 1840s, the Germans in the 1840s. We talked about the new immigration with Italians and Jews and Greeks and Slovaks and Poles. And now a new wave of immigrants coming to America. And there was something else that was very disturbing to Native Americans. Not like, Indians, but nativists. And there were hysterical fears of communism. Absolute hysteria. As Russia fell during World War I in 1917, and a group of people known as the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, overthrew Tsar Nicholas and created a government all their own, in which 5 years of civil war ensued in Russia. And ultimately, in 1922, Russia had a communist government. That was the official government of the United Soviet Socialist Republic, USSR, the Soviet Union. All of that happening spawned a teeny tiny communist party in America. There were communists in the United States. Most people were communists. Teeny tiny amount. Now, tensions were already heightened out of fear of an entire Russia being an enormous nation and its communists. There were strikes, labor strikes happening one after the other because of bad working conditions, long hours, poor treatment of laborers, bad pay, high prices for goods. So any opportunity that business owners had to jump to the conclusion that any strike, any kind of labor trouble, any kind of a chance for a laborer to get ahead, they were going to say, you're a communist. You're communist. All right? And so what they're doing is they're striking fear into people's hearts. There was already a little bit of hysteria over communism. And so now they're able to just point and say, you're a communist if you try to get ahead.
Okay, that's saying you're a communist is crazy, but that can be a little scary because they took over Russia and killed all those people and
Well, Stalin's not in charge yet. It's still Lenin, and he had good intentions.
But, like,
But I
it's
mean,
so
it's still
scary.
communism.
Like when they ran and killed those little kids and stuff, like the Romanovs, like you can't
Yeah,
do
yeah, it was bad. That was
like,
bad.
You can be worried about that. 'Cause,
Sure, I think you're right. And people were like, this whole era we're talking about. It has a name. It's called the Red Scare. The Red
I
Scare.
thought that was so. Like, is this like what led up to like why everyone was so scared in like the '60s and stuff? Like when
Part of
they
it.
took over China.
Part of it, but it's only a small part. This is like a prelude up to that, because this is the very beginning. You know, communism had only been part of Russia for like a month or two at this point.
So this scared us, and then we like completely freaked out when
All
they
right.
were in China.
Yeah, like it wasn't that, like, were there communists in America? Yes. How many? Very few. Very, 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 very few. Okay. But how many labor strikes were there? A bunch. And every single one of them, all those people get labeled as communists. So it is, yeah, people are hysterical, but what are their fears legitimate? No. Are all these laborers communists? I went on strike a few years ago. I'm not a communist. I wanted better working conditions. Okay? So just because people want a better opportunity doesn't necessarily mean you're a communist, obviously. But that's how they were painted. And that's what the hysteria part is. Like they're making irrational decisions. That's what hysteria is. Okay? So, but there are other implications of this, right? Because we as Americans have a difficulty with like, oh, I am good and you are bad, so therefore I must hate you. And so you begin to see an extreme rise in one of the most notorious hate groups to ever exist in the United States that has existed since 1866. The Ku Klux Klan. This is a parade in the mid-1920s in which millions of people came out and watched to support. That's less than 100 years ago, guys. People were like watching the Klan parade around and cheering them. By the way, that's Washington, D.C. That's not like, Georgia. That's this nation's capital. So, this new Ku Klux Klan, spawned by this post-war reaction to these new immigrants, it flourished in the 1920s. And it's easier to describe what the Klan is against than it is to describe what they're for. Like they're anti-foreign, anti-Catholic, anti-black, anti-Jewish, anti-pacifist, anti-communist, anti-internationalism, anti-evolution, anti-alcohol, anti-gambling, anti-adultery, anti-birth control. I guess you could say they were pro-Anglo-Saxon,
They were just pro-hating.
You said that they were
Protestant,
Oh, never mind.
American, native-born American. That's it. So if you were anything other than a Protestant, white, native-born American, they hate you. So it is needless to say, this is a very ultra-conservative group.
Were they isolationists too?
Very much pro-isolationism. Because they were, I wouldn't say pro, I would say more anti-international. They don't want any immigrants. They don't want to even consider any other nations, America or nothing.
While they were doing this, were people like in Congress like, yeah, I'm definitely the Klan?
Yes,
So they would just full out say it?
yes. Especially if you were from a state, especially like in the Midwest or the Bible Belt, like where we live. All right. So, because of this upswing in the sentiment of all these antis, which I know you couldn't write them all down, but it's pretty much everything that we've talked about this year, you're going to see some reaction to it in government. So isolationist America seemed to have little use for immigrants, and so you begin to see some quotas emerge. You guys know what a quota is?
How much of something can come?
Yeah. They're going to put limits on how many people from each nation are allowed to come over. The majority of immigrants in the early 1920s still came from Southern and Eastern Europe. Your Italians, your Greeks, your Poles, Slovaks, Serbians. And once again, these 100% Americans upset about it. They once again use the poem that's written on the Statue of Liberty. You guys know the poem that's written on the Statue of Liberty? Give us your wretched refuse from our teeming shores, something like that. They're like, we don't want your wretched refuse. We don't want anybody. But that's what the Statue of Liberty says. Give us your wretched refuse. So Congress temporarily stopped immigration with the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, which newcomers from Europe were restricted on a yearly basis to only to 3% of that nation. All right, so let me explain this a little better. That was a bad explanation. So, however many, so let's say Ireland. There's a lot of Irish people already in America. So based upon our 1920 census information, because we do a census every 10 years, if we had the total, I'm just doing this for easy math because I'm bad at math. If there were 100 people of Irish descent living in the entire United States, then 3 Irish people would be allowed to immigrate. So 3% of what already existed in our country. Does that make sense? So if it was 10 million, it'd be 3% of 10 million. That's probably easy math too, but I can't do it. I don't know the actual numbers. So in essence, you're only allowed to 3% of what already existed in our own country. So all these new immigrants that didn't have great numbers, they're trying to limit those numbers already. Okay? And then in 1924, they changed it to 2% with the Immigration Act of 1924. It goes from 3% to 2%. To limit it even greater. Also, the Immigration Act of 1924 completely bans Japanese immigrants. So, by the way, still no Chinese allowed because of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. So now they're slamming the door to Japanese immigration as well.
Is Korea a thing yet?
Korea was a thing. And had been a thing, I don't know, only about 2,000 or 3,000 years.
What, was Korea, or was it like?
Part of China.
Okay, so it
Yeah.
been in.
Yeah. All right, so these immigration acts are, I don't want to say it's not a good, it's a big moment in American history because it stops the basically unrestricted immigration to the United States, in which in the preceding years saw some 35 million newcomers. And now that's getting cut to way more than half, like a minute percentage. So the immigrant tide was now cut off, but it left on American shores a patchwork of ethnic communities, just like we discussed, the little Polands, the little Italys. Those existed. And people begin to be separated and segregated based on their own ethnicity, their language, their customs, their religion. Italians, Jews, Poles, isolated in their own houses of worship, had their own newspapers, went to their own movie theaters, had their own schools, organized their own labor unions, all completely separate from mainstream Native American society. There were people that could be born in America and die and live their entire life and die and not learn English if they lived in one of these communities. Okay? So, also during this time, there is an experiment going on. It's not a science experiment. It's called more of a social experiment. And it stems back to the 1840s with the anti-saloon league and the Women's Temperance Christian Union. And it finally comes to a head with the passage of an amendment known as the 18th Amendment. And the 18th Amendment does what? It is the legal abolition of alcohol. No more booze.
I feel like that's so stupid to pass it when they did, because they all just got back from war, they all got PTSD, and I'm not going to let them drink.
I understand.
What are they supposed to do? If
I mean,
you can't drink, what do you do?
talk about disillusionment. This is the epitome, the climax of disillusionment. You've just been over, hanging out in a trench, seeing your buddies getting their faces eaten by rats,
Yeah, exactly.
and now you can't even have a beer in your own
they're
country.
just going to send them back. What are they supposed to do? Did they even have drugs back then?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so did they just do drugs?
I would imagine if you were a person that chose to do drugs, you'd do drugs. Just like today. Michaela?
What year did it?
1919. Now, this is a constitutional amendment. Are those hard to pass? Yeah. They're extremely, has to pass in both houses of Congress, be ratified by the states, signed off by the president. It's hard to do. Okay? So, but the 18th Amendment passes. The 18th Amendment is also known as the Volstead Act. That's the actual name of the legislation. The Volstead, Volstead, Volstead Act, which is the legal abolition of alcohol. And this was particularly popular in the South and in the West, where white people were eager to keep to keep alcohol out of the hands of who they saw as lesser people.
What's the 18th Amendment now?
It's still this, but it's repealed.
Oh,
They just made a new amendment.
I thought they just deleted it and put another one.
No, it's still there. They just had to make another amendment to amend the amendment.
That's so dumb.
That's what we did. All right, so people in the South and West wanted to keep whom they saw as the lesser races in their place. So there is an aspect of racism attached to this. Plus, out west was kind of associated with the saloon. Now, the saloon is not just a bar. The saloon is, a house of corruption, prostitution, gambling. Bad stuff goes down, crime, bad stuff in a saloon, okay? So there was overwhelming support for the Volstead Act in the South and the West. The majority, so these people that wanted, like you see this newspaper article, nation votes itself dry. So people began to describe themselves as either wet or dry. If you were dry, how did you feel about prohibition?
You were okay with
It's
it?
good. If you were wet, that means you wanted to drink. Okay? So, a lot of people who considered themselves wet were foreign-born immigrants who don't have any kind of stigma or negative attitudes towards alcohol.
So the people that thought they were wet, were they the ones that secretly opened bars and stuff?
Many of them did. Many of them did. And we're going to talk all about that. So a lot of these old world people, still didn't see a problem with, drinking beer in a beer garden or at a corner tavern. And, but, these prohibitionists, the dry, they were naive to the extreme. Like, this is a level of naivete that just is never before seen.
Didn't they start drinking ethanol and then someone was like poison it?
A lot of people died from poison from drinking bad booze because they made it in like toilets and stuff, bathtub gin, and people didn't know what they were doing. Some people were trying to like extend the life of like getting good alcohol and then cutting it with like formaldehyde. Yeah, like it was dangerous to have a drink during Prohibition. So these prohibitionists overlooked the American tradition of strong drinks and weak government. Because America had always traditionally had a weak government. And now the central government is going to have authority over the private lives of what you drink, what you bring into your body. They forgot that the federal authorities had never really satisfactorily enforced a law to this magnitude. It's kind of like, hey, let's make the speed limit in Sofia 10 miles an hour. But we're not going to enforce it. Or we're only going to have one police officer, and he's only allowed to work 1 day a week. Can you drive 50 miles an hour? Are people going to get caught 1 day a week? What about all the rest of the people all the rest of the time? You just do whatever you want, right? That is like the equivalency of the federal government's ability to enforce this law.
Well, how did they what if you got caught? Was it like a fine or jail time?
Depends on how much you get caught with. Okay? But as you can see, people didn't seem to be too bothered about it. Consumption of alcohol increases during Prohibition. People drink more than before. Americans don't like to be told what to do, especially by the government. Right, mask wearers? Government tells people wear masks. You've been in public lately? Not a lot of mask wearing going on. So, that is an American idea, guys. They don't like the freedom, okay? So, Prohibition could have been started out on a better foot if they had a much larger army of law enforcement officials. What branch of the government was responsible for this? Like, what part of the government was responsible for enforcing this law? Yeah, what agency within the executive branch? You're right. The IRS, the Internal Revenue Service. When you think of the IRS, what do you think of? Taxes. So why is the IRS responsible for enforcing this? Is alcohol heavily taxed?
Yes.
How long has alcohol been heavily taxed in the United States? Since George Washington, the excise tax on whiskey. Remember that?
So we should have just had another whiskey rebellion.
This was way worse than any whiskey rebellion. Because, Prohibition simply did not prohibit. People still wanted to get their drink. And so they opened these little bars, which were everywhere. They were called speakeasies. Speakeasies. And there would be like secret pass codes to get in. You had to speak softly upon getting in there. But once the door was open, hard liquor especially was drunk in greater masses in speakeasies than ever before. And the thing about speakeasies is that both men and women could go. They were illegal. So men and women were both allowed. Previously to this, women didn't go out to drink at all. If they had a drink, it was in private in their homes, and men were only allowed in bars. Speakeasies mixed the sexes together. which, as you might imagine, has some implications for the future as well, particularly to population increase. Right? Okay. So, a lot of people did get sick from drinking bad alcohol, like homebrew, bathtub gin. It was not uncommon for people to be blinded by drinking this rot gut alcohol because of the.
Permanently?
Yes, it would have killed. Like you drink ethanol or methane or something in, because they didn't make it correct. They used like aluminum
Like
in their
drink-
steel
like
and
drink a full glass or just like a little bit?
little bit. Yeah, dangerous, very dangerous. And that's so. If you're lucky, a lot of people died outright from drinking bad rot gut alcohol. So, the experiment of prohibition itself is noble. Try to make a better society, a sober society. And it wasn't an entire failure. Banks saw savings increase because some people were good, God-fearing, loyal citizens, and they said it's against the law, so I'm not going to do it. And you saw absenteeism at work decline slightly. So some workers, put the bottle down and followed their sober ways. So, but the biggest thing that occurs, one of the biggest things that occurs, is the rise in gangsterism. Gangsterism. Gangsters. Prohibition saw an increase in violent crime like 1,000%. Because lush profits could be made from illegal alcohol, which led to bribing the police, which led to people fighting over what part of cities you were going to have that's going to be your territory where you can sell the alcohol. And so cities started to be carved up by blocks and towns and little Italies and like who's going to have control of what. And then people want to always gain more control. So there's violence that breaks out. Literal wars were breaking out in the cities all across America between rival gangs. Many of these gangs were associated with their ethnicity. Italians versus Irish versus Polacks versus Russians. Often were rooted in immigrant neighborhoods. And all of them want to just make some money. In the 1920s, in the city of Chicago alone, 500 people were murdered. That's a lot of murders, guys. So 500 murders. I don't know that they ever arrested anybody.
Did they know who they were?
If they did arrest somebody, that probably didn't get convicted because you just pay everybody off. You pay the judge off. You find a juror. Hey, here's a bunch of money. Innocent, right? Oh, you don't think we're going to kill your family?
Didn't they get Al Capone on like tax charges?
Tax evasion. Yep. So arrests were few, convictions were even fewer. Button-lip gangsters covered for one another in their own little underworld code of silence. They didn't speak. They wouldn't talk to the police. Chicago was by far the most spectacular example of lawlessness. And in 1925, Scarface, as evidenced by his face, Al Capone, was the most ambitious and murderous of the booze distributors
Wasn't he like a syphilitic idiot?
when he died. But he began 6 years of gang warfare and made millions of dollars cash. In 1920s, millions of dollars in cash. He was like the king of Chicago if there was such a thing, which of course there isn't. But he sped through the streets of Chicago in an armor-plated car, bulletproof windows. And he was branded as public enemy number one. And even he could not be convicted of the cold-blooded massacre on Valentine's Day of 1929, where 7 disarmed members of a rival gang were just shot to death by people in his gang posing to be police officers. He ordered them to be killed. Eventually, though, he is convicted of tax evasion, as he kept great records of all his, all the money he made, but he never paid taxes on any of it. And so when those records were found, he was sentenced to prison for tax evasion, where he served about 11 years of his sentence until he died in prison of syphilis, which is a bad way to go if you guys don't know anything about syphilis. It's an STD and it affects your brain toward the end. So, he looks harmless enough, but he is a bad guy, okay? Now, gangsters rapidly moved and saw other profitable industries that they could get involved in. Prostitution, gambling, narcotics. And then, within the town, the area, the territory which they claimed, honest merchants would have to pay protection money to them. You guys know what protection money is? This is extortion. This is how extortion works. They're like, okay, so you're just let's say you own a flower shop. You're a florist, honest florist. But your flower shop just happens to be in the territory of one of these gangs. So some gang members will come to your flower shop and they'll be like, wow, you got a beautiful flower shop here. There's a lot of bad people that are roaming around out here. You need protection. Wouldn't it be horrible if something were to happen to you, or if somebody threw rocks through your windows, or somebody set your flower shop on fire? So I tell you what, we're going to keep that from happening to you. You're going to pay us every week a certain amount of money, and we'll keep those things from happening to you. Who are the ones that they are paying this protection money from? Them. That is extortion.
So they're just paying them not to beat them up?
Correct. Every week. What happens if you don't have the money or you're short?
You will die.
You get physically harmed. Or a brick thrown through your window. Because they don't care about you. Let's say that you don't pay and they kill you. Somebody else is going to move into that flower shop. And guess what they're going to do when they move in?
Yeah.
The same thing.
What if
That's extortion, okay?
Can you pay two rival gangs at once not to beat you up? Would you have to do that?
Well, you see, the thing is, that's why territory was so well protected. And that's why the gang members would kill each other for trying to cut in on each other's action. Yeah, go ahead. All right? So Chicago's not the only place that this happened. This is happening in almost every major city across America. Chicago is just so prevalent because Chicago's on the banks of Lake Michigan, which borders Canada, which did not have prohibition. So you could put booze on a boat in Canada, take it across the lake, there you are in Chicago, okay? So, questions on gangsterism? Don't get involved in gangs, kids. All right. Okay. Education in the 1920s continued to make giant strides. More and more states were requiring young people to remain in school until they were 16, and some even until they were 18. Wow, can you imagine? Or until you graduated. Some kids may be in school till they're 21 or 20. So the proportion of 17-year-olds who finished high school almost doubles in the 1920s. to almost 25%. Can you imagine that, guys? A 25% graduation rate? And that was double what it was. So it was like 12% graduation rate.
What's our graduation?
Like 80. Something like that.
Yeah, around 75, 80.
Okay, that's not bad.
I mean, it's horrible. But
Well, at least some of us make it.
some of us are going to make it. So, there's a lot of contributions that happen to this that account for these reasons. Better teachers, better education. The idea that education can improve your station in life. Science also made some wondrous advances in these years. There was a massive public health program launched by the Rockefeller Foundation, which virtually wiped out the ancient affliction of hookworms. You guys probably never even heard of hookworms. Hookworms were a big problem in America for especially poor people, especially in the South. But this, the better medical care, better nutrition, better health care, also did a lot to increase life expectancy of newborn infants. And people's life expectancy in general went up from 50 to 59. It's pretty good. 9 years. And that's just from 1901 to 1929, it goes up 9 years. Yet, both science and progressive education in the 1920s were not always welcomed. They were so often subject of unfriendly fire from organized fundamentalist Protestants. These devoted religions charged that teaching Darwin and teaching evolution was destroying the faith of young people in God and the Bible, and also contributing to their moral breakdown. People dancing to jazz music and such. I'm not kidding. So, numerous attempts were made to secure laws prohibiting the teaching of evolution in school. Prohibiting the teaching of evolution in school. In public schools, that is. And a trio of states, all located within the Bible Belt South, including Tennessee, this is where the spirit of that evangelical Protestantism was still the most robust. So this sets the stage for a memorable trial. Today we refer to it as the Scopes Monkey Trial. Scopes Monkey Trial.
Didn't the judge have a heart attack like halfway through?
I do not know that. I'm not saying no. It could have been. I just don't know. So in the town of Dayton, which is in eastern Tennessee, in 1925, a friendly, student-loved, likable high school biology teacher named John T. Scopes delivered a lesson on evolution to his students, for which he was arrested. And indicted by the state for teaching evolution. So this was his crime. Needless to say, when word escapes of this, now is this like a big federal, like is he going to go to prison for life for this? Teaching evolution? No, it's not like that, okay, guys? But when newspaper reporters from around America hear about it, they descend upon the quiet town to witness the spectacle of a trial, which is exactly what it was, a spectacle, something to see. Scopes was defended by nationally known attorneys, while former presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan, an ardent Presbyterian fundamentalist, joined the prosecution. So you got like people that William Jennings Bryan ran for president, and he was an attorney. He's like, I'm going to get in on this. So he's going to be like the prosecutor. He's not from Tennessee. He has nothing to do with prosecuting a local state law of Tennessee. He's not a prosecutor. He's getting in on it, though. It's a spectacle, guys. It's a spectacle. While William Jennings Bryan was the prosecutor, a man volunteers to represent John T. Scopes, and his name was Clarence Darrow. He's a criminal lawyer. And it was an absolute show. It was a show. So William Jennings Bryan delivers a sermon during his prosecution and then puts himself on the stand claiming that he is an expert witness because he knows the Bible. Which was a bad move because Clarence Darrow made him look foolish in a court of law. So 5 days after the trial was over, William Jennings Bryan died of a stroke. Anyways, no doubt, the strain and the heat of a crowded, imagine a courtroom in the South full of people in the summertime. Hot. The wilting heat and the witness stand strain had no doubt did that. So Scopes has his trial. He's found guilty. I mean, he did it. He broke the law. The law said you can't teach evolution. What did he do? He taught evolution. He was found guilty, and he was fined $100, which he didn't even have to pay. Somebody else paid it for him. It's this whole spectacle. But so why are we even talking about this if it's all just a big much ado about nothing? It shows the historic clash between theology and biology, which really shouldn't be clashing. But it's this small group of Protestant fundamentalists who view the Bible as like the end-all, be-all book. They see it as a biology book, as an anthropology book, as a history book, where the Bible itself doesn't claim to be any of those things. But Protestant fundamentalists say, well, we're looking at this and we're going to try to find the answer to everything in these pages. And that's not what it's intended for, according to other people. But Protestants believe it is. So, you see, with this fundamentalism and its emphasis on the literal interpretation of the Bible, it remains a vibrant force in America, not only in the 20s, but all the way up to the 2020s. So it was especially strong in the Baptist church and in the rapidly growing Churches of Christ, organized in 1906, and it still has a strong fervor today. Okay? Questions on that? The Scopes monkey trial? It's called the monkey trial because he's teaching evolution. All right. Okay. How much time we got? We still got plenty of time. All right. Mass consumption economy. Look at that baby shaving. Why they had a baby shaving?
It's a safety razor.
That's right. A safety razor. I don't know about you guys if you've ever used a razor, whether it be on your or wherever, but it's hard to cut yourself with a razor today because they're all safety razors.
Yeah.
What existed before safety razors?
Just the blade.
Straight razor. Let me tell you, if you're not extremely careful with a straight razor, you will harm yourself horribly. And so this is just something to show that, hey, it's so safe, even a baby can use it.
So that's why people went to barbers instead of doing it
Yes.
themselves?
Yes, absolutely. I have a straight razor, and I've maybe used it twice in my life where I didn't cut myself. Every other time, bleeding horrendously for like hours. All right, but this mass consumption economy, Prosperity in America was real, it was sustained, it was widely shared. Now, I'm not saying there weren't poor people. Of course there were. But prosperity was greater during the 1920s than really most any other era of American history up to that point. Hence the name of the 20s, the Roaring Twenties, because the economy is what put the roar into the Roaring Twenties. So the economy was kicked off first by World War I coming to an end, and all of our competitions destroyed. Everywhere else, every other country's factories are laying in ruin, or their people are refugees. Not one shot was fired in America. Not one factory closed down. So everything's still rolling in high gear here. So not to mention all of our ingenious machines powered by relatively cheap industry or energy from recently tapped oil fields right here within the United States of America. All of this dramatically increases productivity. Assembly line production reached perfection under Henry Ford's Rouge River plant, which you got a picture there. What's Henry Ford making? Automobiles. The horseless chariots. By the 1930s, there were about 30 million cars on the road. That's a lot. They'd only been making them for a few years. 30 million of them. The nation had a deepening love of the automobile. And Americans, responded because we had a little money in our pocket and we want to buy stuff. That's like the most American thing, right? You guys like buying stuff, don't you? Yeah. If you don't, you're not American, right? We love buying stuff. That is as American as apple pie. And in responding to our ability to produce and our ability to make and sell and buy, we need to convince people to buy stuff. How do you convince people to buy your stuff? What are all those things? Advertising. A whole new industry is born. It becomes $1 million industry basically overnight. Advertising. Huh?
Does that say make kids husky?
Yes. Obesity was not a problem in the 1920s. Neither was lung cancer, evidently. Look at that. Physicians say Luckies are less. Hey, these are good for you. They got a doctor saying smoking's good for you.
It's
Toasted. Baby shaving. This one at the bottom is they're selling soap that will make you skinny. Use this soap and it'll wash away the fat.
I feel like some of the old ads, it's just a lot.
Hey, do you think that there were some people that were making some claims that were less than true? Why? Huh? They want your money. That's all. That's not a new idea. You ever seen like an old Western with the carpetbagger selling the snake oil? Like, hey, one drink of this and it'll cure your arthritis. It's just whiskey. It's no different. This is no different. Okay? But the art of persuasion in the 1920s is pretty much the same as it is today. When you turn on television commercials today, you see the same ploys being used. Seduction, sexual suggestion. They want to make you feel discontent with what you have, and therefore you will want to go out and buy more. That is the entire purpose of the advertising industry. Does it work? Yeah. There's a little event this weekend. I don't know if you guys are aware of it. It's called the Super Bowl. Ever heard of it? How much is a 30-second advertisement during that? It's millions of dollars. millions of dollars for 30 seconds of air, literal air. Once that 30 seconds is over, it's over. It's gone. Not to be seen on television. It's gone. Why and how on earth are these companies affording, and how do they justify spending millions of dollars for 30 seconds of air? Because it works.
I mean, it's the Super Bowl. Everyone's gonna watch.
Everybody going to watch it, and everybody's going to talk about it the next day.
Even people who don't like football are gonna watch it because they watch it for the commercials.
Yeah. Yeah. And the halftime show. And the Bengals winning. Can y'all believe they're in the Super Bowl? How have we not talked about this? Y'all, I was 8 years old the last time they were in the Super Bowl.
We don't like
8.
the Eagles.
8. Well, not everybody's perfect.
We do not like the Eagles.
You like them way more than that.
Okay, yeah, we know like more than the Rams, but well, actually we hate them less than the Rams.
There you go. I'll take it. All right. So this new profession emerges, the advertiser, and every advertising man studied, how to do it better, and anyway, it becomes $1 million industry. You ever watched or heard of that TV show Mad Men? It's an advertising agency in the 50s. I've never watched it, but I hear it shows some of the intricacies of it. Mass consumption. We've already talked about sports. Remember, we had talked about football back in the day. Sports becomes big business too as part of the economies, and you see home run heroes like George Herman Ruth, also known as Babe Ruth. He becomes like an advertising celebrity, one of America's first advertising celebrities. Named a candy bar after him. Baby Ruth. Now I'm hungry. Okay, so we'll stop there, and we will talk more about automobiles and the implications of their usage in America tomorrow. Friday we'll do a fun activity. Well, it's fun for me.